Chapter 29. The efforts of the devil to prevent the conversion of those who, knowing the diseased character of their souls, desire to amend their lives. The reason why their good intentions are frequently ineffectual. Those who are cognizant of the diseased character of their souls and desire to cure them are often deluded by the devil. He endeavors to persuade them that they have a long time to live, and consequently may safely defer their conversion. He insinuates the impression that some business affair or difficulty must be cleared up before they can devote themselves sufficiently to the spiritual life and fulfill its duties without disturbance. This snare has entangled, and daily does entangle many, but its success is directly attributable to their own supine neglect of a matter in which the glory of God and their own salvation should be the only considerations. Let persons of this type say, Now, instead of tomorrow, tomorrow. Why tomorrow? How can I be sure of living until it comes? And even if I were, would I really be trying to save my soul if I delayed my repentance? Would it look as though I sought victory if I exposed myself to fresh wounds? It is beyond all dispute that a willing cooperation with the graces of heaven is the only way of escaping this delusion. Together with the methods suggested in the preceding chapter, when I say willing cooperation, I do not mean mere desires or feeble and sterile resolutions by which so many are deceived. The following are the reasons. First, the foundation for such desires and resolutions is not mistrust of one's own abilities and confidence in God. The result is that our soul, inflated with secret pride, is so blind that it takes for solid virtue what is a mere illusion. The remedy for this evil, and the acumen necessary to recognize it, must be obtained from heaven, which permits us to fall. This is done that our eyes may be opened by sad experience, that we may reassign the confidence we had in ourselves to divine grace, that we may exchange an almost imperceptible pride for a humble knowledge of our own weakness. Good resolutions will never be effectual unless they are firm and steady, and they will never be firm and steady unless they are founded on a mistrust of one's own strength and on confidence in God. Second, when we make a good resolution, we merely consider the beauty and excellence of virtue, which attracts even the most vapid minds, but we never consider the difficulties of attaining it. Consequently, cowardly souls are dismayed at the first sign of trouble, and they hurriedly abandon their project. For this reason, it would be better for you to consider the difficulties which occur in acquiring virtue, rather than the virtues themselves, and to prepare yourself accordingly. You may rest assured that the greater courage you show in conquering yourself or defeating your enemies, the sooner will your difficulties diminish, and they will gradually vanish. Third, we are too concerned with our personal advantage, rather than with virtue and adherence to the will of God. This frequently happens when we are comforted by the consolations we receive in a time of affliction. Finding that the comforts of the world have escaped us, we resolve to dedicate ourselves to God's service. To be free of this charge, let us be careful not to misuse the grace of God. Let us be humble and prudent in forming good resolutions. Let us not seek extraordinary favors through rash promises which are beyond our capacities to fulfill. If we are burdened with affliction, let us merely ask to carry our cross as we should, since it comes from God. Let this be our glory, and we shall seek no alleviation from earth or heaven itself. Let us ask, let us implore only that God may strengthen us in our trial, that we may patiently undergo the trials which he sees fit to send. Chapter 30. Concerning the delusions of some who consider themselves on the way to perfection. The frustration of the enemy in his first and second attacks will not discourage him from trying again to bring about your ruin. He would have you unconscious of your actual vices and passions, filling your imagination with visions of chimerical perfection, which he knows you will never attain. Because of this subtle deception, we receive frequent and dangerous setbacks without giving much thought to means of countering them. Secret pride has seized upon these fanciful desires, mistaking the dream for the reality, and we rest in exalted notions of our own sanctity. Therefore, at the very time when the least contradiction or affront upsets us, we amuse ourselves with grandiose dreams of being ready to suffer the greatest torments or the pains of purgatory itself for the love of God. Our deception consists in the tendency of our sensitive nature, serenely comfortable when sufferings are at a distance, boldly to compare itself with those stalwart souls who bear the greatest pains with unwearied patience. To avoid such a snare, we must fight the enemies at hand in a world of reality, rather than achieve meaningless victories in a self-created world of fancy. Then we shall see if our resolutions are cowardly or courageous, imaginary or real, and thus advance to perfection in the footsteps of the saints. We need not concern ourselves with those enemies who rarely molest us, unless we have reason to expect an attack from them, in which case we must be fortified with the soldier's resolve to conquer. But let us not mistake resolutions for victories, even though we have made considerable progress in acts of virtue. True humility should accompany us with the ever-present memory of our weakness, bidding us put our confidence in God alone. Let us beseech him to be our strength in the battle, our shield in danger, and our protection against presumption and confidence in our own abilities. This is our path to greatness and perfection, a path along which we may find many difficulties for our frail natures, that we may thereby be humbled and preserve the little reward our good work has already merited. Chapter 31. Concerning the artifices employed by the devil to make us forsake the virtuous life. The fourth artifice which the devil employs on those who are advancing in the way of perfection is to fill them with ill-timed resolutions, which in different circumstances would be quite commendable, but in the existing condition only engender vicious habits. For example, a sick person bears his illness with such resignation that the enemy fears he will acquire habitual patience, and suggests to the victim the many creditable works he might do were he in a state of health. The victim is persuaded that this would be a service to God, humanity, and to his own soul, were he physically well, and soon the enemy contrives to make him desirous of health, and uneasy under his burden. The more earnest the wish, the greater the disappointment, and patience at length gives way to impatience under a burden that is viewed as hindering the accomplishment of works most acceptable to God. Once the enemy has gained his point, the grand designs vanish gradually, and the patient is left with a gnawing dissatisfaction, and all the attendant evils arising from an impatient desire to cast off a yoke. Thus, what was once promised to be a source of habitual virtue has become a source of lamentable vice. Such a delusion can be dispelled by exercising caution in the formation of pious designs, incompatible with the state of suffering with which you are visited. For here ambition overreaches itself and leaves only anxiety and vexation. Be mindful, in humility and resignation, that all of the benevolent aims you now have may not be carried out for want of courage once God has made you equal to their execution. At least you must consider the possibility of God's denying you the satisfaction of doing a good work, either by a hidden disposition of divine providence, or as an atonement for past offenses. Perhaps, in his wisdom, he wishes to see your human will attuned to his divine will, and see you humbled in spirit before omnipotence itself. Show the same resignation when, either under the direction of your confessor, or for some other reason, you are obliged to refrain from a time from Holy Communion. Rather than be disturbed by this loss, you should say within your heart, "Were I not guilty of some failing or shortcoming before the Lord, I would not be thus deprived of receiving him. Blessed be the name of him who has revealed to me my true unworthiness. I know, O Lord, that in all the trials of my life I need to do nothing but bear them patiently in the hope of pleasing thee, offering to thee a heart conformable to thy holy will. I know that in giving my heart to thee, it will be nourished in divine consolation and fortified from the ever-threatening powers of hell. O Creator and Redeemer, do with me as thou wilt. May thy will be my strength, now and forever. All I ask is a cleansed and virtuous soul, worthy of receiving thee, and desirous of executing thy every wish. Those who assiduously follow these counsels may be assured that, although they undertake a work of piety far beyond their capacities, they will nevertheless advance in the way of salvation and in the way of serving God in the most acceptable manner. This is true devotion, even though the motivation in this case be a device of the devil to breed repugnance for virtue, or inspired by heaven to test obedience. It still can prove ultimately beneficial to the soul. We must exercise considerable caution, however, in employing certain means utilized by the saints for eliminating troublesome infirmities, as we are often too eager for the success of these measures. Again, we must be utterly resigned, proposing nothing to ourselves but the holy will of God. For who of us can read in the mind of God his solution to our individual problems? If you rashly presume to improve on the divine plan, you will be the sufferer, for impatience will follow your consequent disappointment, and even if you do not actually manifest patience, you have already lost that resignation that renders your acts meritorious in the sight of God. One cannot overlook at this point a secret artifice of self-love which adroitly camouflages, as it were, even the most blatant imperfections. A sick person, for instance, believes that his impatience springs from a just cause, that is, rather than impatience properly speaking. His uneasiness is to him a commendable regret for his faults, which incurred the punishment of illness, or a just regret for the inconvenience he causes those who tend him. The ambitious man who laments his failure to obtain a cherished position behaves similarly. He would be shocked were one to attribute his lamentations to vanity, and he protests his commendable motive, which he well knows would influence him little in different circumstances. Likewise, the sick man who pretends so much uneasiness on account of the inconvenience caused those who tend him is no sooner well than he loses his solicitude for the suffering of his attendants at the hands of others. Obviously, his patience is not a glowing tribute to his sympathy for others, but rather an actual indictment of his love for himself. And thus we advert again to the patient's acceptance of the crosses of life, which, like a thread, must be woven into the fabric of our spiritual lives.